Law School, an abolitionist, and just an amazing leader in the community. I want to also acknowledge our former co-president, Amanda Chan, who brought this event to the forefront and who has done an amazing job organizing. And I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Harvard Law School chapter of the American Constitution Society. Thank you all so much for co-sponsoring this event. And I'm excited for an engaging conversation. Okay, Amber, take it away.
Thank you so much, Serena. And thank you, Professor Sullivan and Professor Freed, both for being here for what I'm sure will be an interesting and engaging conversation. Just to give a very brief overview of how the conversation will go, I'm just going to take a couple minutes at the very beginning to frame the issue, frame the conversation. I will ask you all a general opening question to share thoughts that you have on this. I will ask 1 to 2 follow-up questions, however much time we have, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from all of our participants. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll read them out. And I hope to keep about 20 minutes at the end of this for us to have Q&A. Thank you again so much for being here. And just to frame the conversation a bit, obviously this is a moment of upheaval, of uncertainty and uprising, really, when so many people are reevaluating their relationships to public safety, to law enforcement, to carceral institutions such as policing, such as prisons and incarceration. And we think that this is also an incredible moment when so many people in the streets and all over the country are reevaluating those relationships. We think this is also a moment that Harvard should be evaluating its relationships to carceral institutions such as policing, such as prisons. And we frame this conversation around private prisons specifically, but we know that private prisons are only a small portion of the total population of 2.4 million people that are incarcerated every year in the United States. And we know that the issues associated with privatization of the prison industry do not start and end purely with private prisons, but extend to a whole host of companies that make billions of dollars a year in other forms of prison profiteering. Based on research that the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign has done, we know that of the 1% of Harvard's $41 billion endowment that is publicly disclosed, Harvard has millions of dollars invested in companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group, which are the 2 largest private prison operators in the country. They're also the largest operators of private immigrant detention centers in the country, which is a very quickly growing industry where conditions have been so terrible that it's driven people to suicide. The sites where thousands of children, immigrant refugee children, are being separated from their families, that all occurs in private prisons such as Geo Group and CoreCivic that Harvard is currently profiting from. We also know that Harvard, based again just on the 1% of the endowment that's publicly disclosed, we also know that Harvard has money invested in Tokyo Holdings, which is one of the biggest players in the $2 billion bond industry and the bail bond industry, which keeps people who are legally innocent inside cages because they simply don't have enough money to get out and await their constitutionally ordained trial. So we know that Harvard's profiting from that as well. We know that Harvard has investments in Axon, which is the manufacturer of tasers, which the police that are suppressing the uprising in the streets right now use. And over 1,000 people over the last several decades have been killed directly by tasers, and who knows how many more have been harmed, but that harm has not been recorded. So we know that Harvard is also profiting from that as well. And again, we know that the harms associated with carceral institutions like private prisons and like companies that serve goods, private for-profit companies that serve goods and services for prisons. We know that all of those are not publicly disclosed. Many of them are run by private equity funds. Many of them are not going to show up in public disclosures, but that does not mean that the harm that they cause or the problems that they present from a legal and moral perspective are not ones that should be looked into. But again, all of that is occurring in the black box that is the other $40 billion of Harvard's endowment that is not disclosed. So we thought that this was a really important moment for us as members of the Harvard community to be in conversation with you all as professors in the Harvard community to take this radical revolutionary moment, again, with so much uncertainty, and turn that into a moment of deep critical thinking and deep interrogation as to what Harvard's relationship is to carceral institutions, the moral, legal, and other perspectives and problems that might be presented from Harvard's own prison profiteering, particularly for the law school, an institution that teaches students like myself human rights and civil rights, teaches students about the criminal law. I had the pleasure and privilege of being a student in Professor Sullivan's Criminal Justice Institute, where I saw firsthand how the underbelly of the prison industrial complex and how it works, and the many different actors that are earning billions of dollars a year on keeping humans in cages. So what is Harvard's responsibility? What should our expectation as members of the Harvard community be as to this institution holding up its values, not just in the classroom, but also in its finances and also in the endowment? So I thank you all so much again for being here for this conversation. And I would just like to open it up now. I'd like to start with Professor Freed. If you would just give us your perspective, where should Harvard stand on prison profiteering, private prisons? And if you have perspectives from the legal perspective, from the moral perspective, ethical perspective, we'd love to hear them.
Well, thank you. I think I was reflecting on this. This has not been a subject I have long been involved in or interested in, really. But I got interested in part when I heard you talk about it at a different forum. And let me tell you how I came to be convinced that this is an important issue and that Harvard money is on the wrong side of it. A few years ago, about 5 years ago, my son, who is a philosopher, and I wrote a book where, among other things, we argued why torture is wrong under all circumstances for whatever reasons. And that is because the purposeful mutilation of a fellow human being, other than as an incident, a necessary incident of urgent and immediate self-defense, is an abomination. It is inhuman, it is horrible. Well, we argued that at some length, convinced ourselves, maybe some others. We gave the argument, by the way, at West Point, and we had no difficulty convincing the cadets and their teachers. It was a wonderful, receptive audience. But as I reflected on the argument we made, I realized that in fact we had made an argument against the death penalty, because imprisonment, except as a necessary defense against dangerous people who will harm us, is just as much a mutilation of a fellow human being as cutting off a limb or an ear. Except it's cutting off one of the most precious things any person has, years of life. Cutting the person off from human contacts, family contacts, human activities, human contribution, ordinary life. It may be necessary, but only so far as it is. Anything else is gratuitous cruelty. Prisons are far from where human life goes on in a human way. No contribution is really possible. No real contacts with family, even no real contact with food. A truly humane system would avoid any unnecessary deprivation. It would be costly. It would be sort of Scandinavian, but it's the price that society must pay for its safety, the safety that it is procuring by protecting itself against certain people who would do it harm. Now, private for-profit prisons relieve society of its responsibility instead of directly discharging its responsibility to treat people humanely with as little deprivation as is necessary for the purpose. It hives this off on private organizations to discharge this obligation for it. Well, a for-profit prison has only a contractual obligation to discharge society's obligation to its prisoners. And those contracts are hard to write. I know about contracts, and hard to make in such a way that they are truly enforceable in terms of the moral imperative. The prison has the private prison, for-profit prison, does have a fiduciary obligation to its shareholders, which include Harvard, as it turns out. And that means it is bound to give the prisoners as little of what they are entitled to and as cheaply as possible. Anything else is wasting corporate assets. And it shows. Look at the food in private prisons. Look at the facilities, the staffing, the educational and recreational activities. One of the things that struck me more than anything, because it's just emblematic, though it's a small thing, they make money on the telephone calls that prisoners make to their families. That is their lifeline to humanity. That is their lifeline to life. And these people provide it as expensively as they can. That is to say, if they charged any more, people wouldn't make the phone calls. It's what a profit-making organization does. Instead of viewing their responsibility or our responsibility to the humanity of the prisoners. Now, what keeps other institutions that perform civic functions for us? Hotels, colleges, all sorts of restaurants, railroads. What keeps them discharging their responsibilities collectively? Competition. But the prisoners are not the customers. The customer is the state. And the customer here does not have any interest in enforcing the humane treatment of the prisoners. The prisoners are not the customers. If they were, competition might be working, but it's not. So the result is a system that is designed to be as minimally humane, as minimally discharging of the responsibility of society to this portion of its citizens, and Harvard should not be making money on this. Private prisons should not exist because they provide, they discharge a responsibility which is society's responsibility, and they discharge it as meanly and as cheaply as possible. That is a bad business to be in, and Harvard should be in something else. Waste disposal, garbage, whatever, but not this.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. Professor Sullivan, would you give us your perspective on where Harvard should stand on prison profiteering?
Well, a phrase like that, that compels only one answer.
Would probably be called a leading question, but sorry.
So first and foremost, thanks for the invitation. And I'd like to say publicly that Amber's one of my favorite students of all time. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here and to have you moderate this important discussion. So I would adopt by reference nearly everything that Charles said. I don't want to be redundant, but I think he gave us an absolutely terrific frame for how to think about the issue. To answer your question directly, an emphatic no, Harvard should not profit from private prisons. They are an absolutely awful institution, and the state, the government should not give this important function over to a private entity. So let me just pick up on one or two aspects of what Charles said, and I'll be brief, and this will, I think, give more time for some back and forth and some interaction. So I'll pick up on the point that he made about private prisons being private entities who have a duty to their shareholders. So the very thing that makes a private profit-seeking institution good is also the very thing that makes it problematic as a government, as providing an essential government service. So like most institutions, I mean, what would you think constitutes the most significant cost to these prisons? And it is labor. It's a labor cost. About 60 to 70% of the cost are to the people, the guards and so forth, the folks who run the institution. There is a built-in incentive, therefore, to keep costs down so that profits can go up. How do you keep costs down? You pay lower rates than the state and the government pays for prison guards, and it's a built-in disincentive for the sort of training that would make for good prison guards, good programming, and so forth. So there are these built-in incentives for profit that make for bad persons who are running and administering the prisons. So that's why there are both quality and safety concerns, and you mentioned some of them, Amber, and I won't go into detail, but that's the price that society pays for profitable private prisons. As a moral matter, so I'm speaking now just on a normative register, Harvard should use its considerable voice to say no, that this is an institution that we will not support. I mean, it was very nice that that President Bacow wrote a flowing letter about George Floyd and about Harvard's commitment to racial justice and equality, etc. But who disproportionately fills these prisons? They are young, primarily African-American men who represent a percentage far disproportionate to our percentage in the population. That's who's populating these places. That's who, that's the population, among others, obviously, who are being treated in the crude ways that Charles so well described. So I would say to the institution, put action behind your prose. If you are concerned about racial justice, here's one way. Here's one way you might make that manifest to the whole country and to the world, to say that we're not going to be part of this. We're not going to profit one penny from this because it's wrong. Simple, end of story, because it is wrong. So one last thing I want to mention, and hopefully it'll come up in the conversation, it is sometimes gets lost. Amber, you mentioned it in passing, but I want to be express that although only 8 or 10% or so of the entire prison population are in private prisons, almost half of the population of immigration detention cases are in these privately held facilities. And if you think that citizens are treated badly, only imagine what goes on in these immigration detention centers. Almost half. The last data I saw was around 43, 44%. Significant number of folks in these private institutions. And the same companies that you mentioned, Amber, are the same companies that own these immigration detention centers as well. So that's part of the puzzle, that's part of the calculus that we should discuss.
Thank you so much for that. I enjoyed all of your comments, but of course, being acknowledged as one of your favorite students was a personal highlight. But I did want to pick up on something that you both mentioned, and I want to make sure, since it seems like we're all aligned on private prison operators like CoreCivic, like Geo Group, being wrong, being antithetical to what an institution like Harvard should stand for. I want to move our attention then to what will likely be a less clear-cut case for all of us on this call, which is not the companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group that operate the four walls of private for-profit prisons, but the companies that operate in for-profit companies that provide goods and services to prisons and jails and immigrant detention centers that are run by the government. So they are also for-profit companies. They are also operating in the prison space, but they are not the four walls. And I'm going to give a couple examples, many of which actually come from my experience in CJI, which I mentioned earlier, representing a man that I talk about as Mr. Brown when I speak about him in public. And he, working with him and going to the correction center every week to talk to him and talk about his case, I really got a chance to understand how, even though he was in a facility that was operated by the sheriff's office, a government entity, definitely not a for-profit entity, a lot of the experiences that he had inside were driven by what I would describe as prison profiteers. So a couple examples that I'll just give. Professor Freed, you talked about how the fundamental evil, and I think you described it as mutilation, of being torn away from your family, having contact with your community, contact with your loved ones cut off. So the first day I met Mr. Brown, it was his daughter's birthday. And we started talking about phone calls and having to get money on the books for that. And I did some research later and found out that in some places it costs as much as $25 to make a 15-minute phone call for somebody who's incarcerated. And again, Professor Freed, you mentioned that this is literally and figuratively a captive audience. The phone operators have a captive market and they have a total monopoly. And they earn that monopoly by sending kickbacks to the sheriff's office and to the other government entities for every phone call that's made, which then, of course, drives the cost up for people who are incarcerated. Also, the first day I met Mr. Brown, I noticed that his hand was injured. he had been in a fight. He had been jumped shortly before he was arrested. And so his fingers looked something like this. And it took over a month for him to be taken to a clinic to get his hands bandaged, to get them set straight. And then I did some research and found out that a large percentage of clinics that are operated in, again, government-owned prisons and jails, those clinics are for-profit entities that are owned by private equity funds and otherwise that have the same profit motive that you talked about, Professor Sullivan, and specifically the same labor costs. So, you know, the only way that these companies turn a bigger profit for the private equity funds that own them is by skimping on the staff, you know, hiring workers at a low and paying them a lower rate and hiring fewer people, which means the lines get pretty backed up for folks who are trying to see the doctor or the clinic inside. Professor Freed, you mentioned food, I believe, and
I did.
and which is obviously an essential for anybody to survive anywhere, in prison or otherwise.
But
And I
it's
remember
more than that, Amanda, Amber. It's
it's okay.
The food is one of the few things that the prisoner looks forward to 3 times a day, and if that turns out to be a source of disgust rather than, you know, possible pleasure, that is a mutilation.
Great point and great word. And so there are 2 ways I think this is important to think about. So Mr. Brown spent some time working in the kitchens and the facilities in which he was incarcerated. And he would tell me about the maggots and mold that he would see on the food. He would talk about food that's rotten when it comes into the kitchen, off the truck already. Food that's so bad that once he had spent time working in the kitchen, he just didn't want to eat it anymore. So then he started going to the commissary, which is like the corner store inside the prison facility, where they're charging exorbitant rates for cups of ramen noodles and other essentials that people are surviving on. But again, they're a captive market. There's no control from them as customers in terms of pricing. And so they can be charged $1 for a cup of noodles that would cost, 10 cents if you got it on Amazon or something, and a facility where they might earn $1 a day doing work inside the facility. So I wanted to just bring up some of those examples because I don't think they're quite as clear cut as the private prisons, again, that operate the four walls, but a lot of the same issues that you all raised in terms of private prisons and the incentives also come up with all of these other companies that are operating in the industries, but just a little bit more on the margins. And the last thing I wanted to raise before I get your perspectives on this is the implications of lobbying for all of this. So we know that Geo Group and Core Civic and all of these companies spend millions of dollars in lobbying every year for politicians to be tougher on crime, to write the laws in such a way that people are in prison for longer, to criminalize more and more activity. So I also wanted to get your thoughts on that perspective. But let me know what you think. We're all aligned that private prisons are terrible for all of the reasons you outlined. But where do you see tensions or differences, if at all, between the companies that are operating the 4 walls of the prison and the companies that are offering the goods and services that government entities are utilizing?
It's a slippery slope, and it's very difficult because it's not only the organizations you mentioned, but it's the utility company. It's the same people who provide electricity, who provide plumbing and so on, the contractors who build the prisons. At some point, you've got to say, we exist in a capitalist society, we exist in a market economy, and the idea that somebody is providing a service cannot be as preclusive as the whole prison, private prison is. Well, how do you draw that line? I understand that that's a dilemma. But what happens in the private prison is that the whole entity is hived off. The society discharges its whole responsibility on someone else, the private prison, while in the examples you give, the sheriffs, the jail, and so on, those people are still public officials. The persons who are incarcerated have relatives. They vote in many states. We just got them the vote in Florida. And the egregious Governor Scott wants to take it away from them again. So there's a greater responsibility in the contracting enterprise, which the private prison totally pushes off on someone else. It's a matter of degree, I understand. The private prison is the extreme. There's no reason for it to exist. It shouldn't exist. The electric company, the phone company, the grocers, the farmers, they have to exist. But the responsibility of the state for the health of the prisoners is more direct. And in fact, you have Eighth Amendment recourse. Much harder to have that against a private prison. That gets into a very complicated subject. But I would start with the private prisons and worry about the rest later. Oh, and as to the lobbying, give me a break. This is the swamp that Trump was going to drain, but he is its prime dweller.
I won't argue with you on the swamp point. Professor Sullivan, what do you think? Do you think the line can be drawn? Do you think this is an issue of scope or degree, or do you want to just throw the whole thing away like some people?
No, I think that I think that we do have to do the hard work to draw a line somewhere, and I haven't thought about it long enough to know exactly where. That's one. Two, I learned something by your question that I hadn't known before, like the food vendor and so forth. So that's quite interesting. I know a lot about the one of the major telephone providers, and that's horrible on two registers. One, the cost associated with making calls, and two, there are a host of Fourth Amendment issues in terms of what they record and how they record and so forth, even with respect to lawyer calls that are problematic. And then, it's a private company, so it's not the state, probably outside the scope of this particular panel, but perhaps fodder for something else. So, so here are my thoughts, right? Like, I wouldn't expect the state to do HVAC, for example. So let's say you're in Minnesota and and there's a heating system there. It's probably wholly inefficient for the state to create heating units and that sort of thing. But to go to I won't advertise for anybody, but whoever the HVAC company is and say, hey, we need heat installed in here. The line is going to look, to my thinking, something like if a company does the majority of its business in this particular space, and it begins to look in some way non-competitive. So, for example, in the criminal law, so my first year criminal law class, we teach a number of cases and how one gets at intent For example, let's take drugs or whatever. If you're selling paraphernalia that, say, for marijuana, let's say papers that one rolls marijuana for, if you sell those at prices that seem to just far exceed the market, then you know that you're doing it for a particular purpose, and that purpose, in my example, is illegal, but let's call it illicit or immoral in the other sense. So if there's this food company, I would, please send me whatever you have on that. I hadn't heard about this, but if they are making unusual profits for what they do, then the line ought to be somewhere around there. I hate to try to fashion rules on the fly, but that's the intellectual approach I would suggest there. And with respect to the lobbying, Charles's imagery was so vivid. I'm going to just leave that alone.
Well, I would just add this thing, Amber. Compare the food vendors to American Airlines to the food vendors to a prison. The food vendors to American Airlines are not American Airlines. American Airlines is their customers, but American Airlines customers can complain about the food and can hurt American Airlines' bottom line by saying, you're serving us terrible food. And we know that airlines, in fact, compete in terms of such things. The prisoners cannot do that. So they are in the same position. And that, I think, is a way to get a handle on this subject.
I like that example, but I think that supports my point better than yours, Professor Fried, because if I'm an incarcerated person inside a facility that
What did you think my point was?
Well, you were saying that it's a slippery slope and that the private prisons, we should start there and the other stuff is a little murkier. But I think the example you just gave is an indication that maybe the line can be drawn rather clearly, because if I'm an incarcerated person inside a facility that's run by the sheriff's office or some government agency, and they've outsourced the work of providing food or anything else, I can complain to them all day, but my voice, it's not like I can just pick up and leave and go eat somewhere else. So the captive population, literally and figuratively, is what, to me, creates the problems associated with the private company that provides food or the private company that provides healthcare are mirrored by the problems associated with the private prison company.
Amber, if you were my student and this were a class, I would say, yes, Amber, and therefore, finish the sentence.
Oh, well, my answer is that Harvard shouldn't be invested in any of these in prison companies or any of that. I'm very clear on that. The lines for me are very easy to draw, because I think the entire
line
system
about Harvard. But should these businesses exist?
Absolutely not. That's why the lines are easy for me to draw, because I think the same exact arguments you made about private prisons, I would make about the entire $1 trillion prison industrial complex that allows companies providing food, healthcare, phone, whatever, that allows these companies to make billions of dollars on keeping people in cages and then buy off politicians who write tough on crime laws to keep people in jail for longer.
You're saying that the government should be providing these services directly. I said the government should be imprisoning directly if it's going to imprison. You're saying you're going further. If there's any service provided in a prison, the government should provide that as well. And Ron says, yeah, well, what about the HVAC and the plumbing and the electric utility and so on? So the therefore bothers me a little bit.
Okay. I mean, my therefore is necessarily probably going to be a little bit more radical, because I think the entire trillion-dollar prison industrial complex is rotten to the core. And the idea that any company, whether it's the for-profit prison that provides the four walls of the facility, whether it's the phone, whether it's healthcare, whether it's food, the idea that any company can make the billions of dollars that are being generated from throwing humans in cages just doesn't sit well with me at all. So the lines are a little bit easier for me to draw. But I don't want to get stuck here, because we have only it's 6:43, and I promised to leave time for questions. Leading into questions, the last 30 seconds, 60 seconds, I want you all to talk to us a little bit about where you stand personally as a Harvard professor, specifically Harvard Law School professors that are teaching students criminal law, constitutional law, contracts, whatever it is, teaching students that you hope will go out into the world and be decent lawyers and not embarrass the profession. How do you feel about being Harvard Law professors, knowing that the institution that's hired you and charged you with training the next generation of people to protect rights is also an institution that's profiting from companies that are trampling on people's civil and human rights?
I mean, I guess
we made our position clear.
Yeah. I don't have to feel a special way as a Harvard Law School professor. I feel as a citizen and as a human being that it's wrong. But I see your point. As a law professor, I would think it wildly inconsistent with the aim, the goal, the ambition of the law school. As a professor at the university, I think it's also inconsistent with our mission as a university. But more fundamentally, as a human being and as a citizen, I don't think that that Harvard should be investing in that. So, you can put an ellipsis after as a and fill in a number of things. As an alum of the institution, on all of those grounds, I think that Harvard, however large or small, ought to rethink its position as an ethical proposition.
Professor Freed, do you have anything else to add, or can we go to?
No, that's it.
Okay.
I agree with Ron.
Great. So the first question we have in the chat is, can you please discuss the benefits of a prison system at all? The burden of proof lands on those advocating for these systems or policies. I didn't plant that. That's actually in the chat. Who wants to go first?
So what was it, Amber? Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
The burden?
Can you please discuss the benefits of a prison system at all? The burden of proof lands on those advocating for these systems or policies.
Yeah. Gee, I don't think that's all that hard at that level of generality. There are dangerous people out there, people who would harm us, people who cannot be counted on to be corrected, and we need to be protected against them. But the method of protection can go no further than that need of protection. But to suggest that there's never a justification for depriving a person of his liberty or her liberty when that person is going to do harm to fellow citizens, I don't know what kind of universe you live in, but it's not one that I know of.
Professor Sullivan, what do you think?
So I am not an abolitionist in the way I understand people to use the term, to say that no prisons at all. And so I do think that we incarcerate at dangerously high numbers, that we overuse it, that we need a more robust mental health system, a whole lot of things But the notion that we don't need a prison system at all, I don't subscribe to. I spent a number of years as a public defender, and I'm convinced that there are some among us who cannot exist in civil society, and in that sense, we do need prisons. I think that number could be reduced exponentially because we put people in prisons where there are very many reasonable alternatives to incarceration.
And for a length of time which far exceeds the necessity which you and I mentioned.
And here's the thing about length of time. Thank you, Charles. I'll add to that. There is relatively no dispute among sociologists and criminologists that after a certain amount of time, prison has an affirmative criminogenic impact. And criminogenic is a term that the sociologists and criminologists use to mean that you get worse over time, that it has a negative impact. And it's very odd that in at least in this area of criminal law, which includes the prison population, we know what works and we know what doesn't work, and there's an appalling lack of political will to implement this. We are in a society where where there's a sort of tough on crime political vocabulary carries such currency that we just make a number of bad decisions that thoughtful people from all sides of the ideological spectrum agree is wrong and bad and dangerous, but we do it nonetheless. Now I am curious, and we have this debate in my criminal law class. Amber, you didn't take criminal law from me, but for the abolitionists, for the violent serial killer, let's say Son of Sam or whatever, the most vicious one you can think of, what result, what do we do with that person? I know you're not a panelist, but I'm just.
No, I'm happy. I was just on mute. I'm happy to hop in. I was going to take moderator's license to do so anyway, because I do think about this very differently. So the question in response to what do we do with the most horrible among us? The question I get a lot from people who ask about abolition is, what do we do with the murderers? What do we do with the rapists? Just the worst people that you can think of. And I am an abolitionist because I believe that the carceral state, including prisons, including policing, including responding to social problems with prisons and policing, rather than with care, with actual safety, with health, homelessness, all of that kind of stuff. I'm an abolitionist because I believe we create the monsters that you two have said we need to have prisons to throw people into. I think that prisons and policing and the entire carceral system generates people, the types of people that we're all viscerally very afraid of. And so responding, we know that harm and violence are more likely to occur. They occur in cycles. And policing is violent, prisons are violent. So if we want to eliminate violence from society, my argument is we have to stop investing in the institutions that are perpetuating and creating violence. But the question specifically about what do we do with serial killers, what do we do with rapists? Well, only 1% of people who have, I'm gonna get the statistic right, only 1% of rape cases end in incarceration. So there's a lot of people who have committed rape who are actually in the streets right now.
Child molesters.
Also, excellent point. And I'm going to use R. Kelly as an example because he had this whole documentary series that was really, really, really hard to watch. But I managed to make it through the first few episodes. And I think in the second episode, his brother talked about how he and Robert Kelly were both molested as children by one of their relatives for years. And an abolitionist intervention is, we want to protect kids from abuse and violence. We want to have systems for accountability and wellness and care so that someone like Robert Kelly, the 8-year-old, can get treatment, can get counseling, can work through that pain so that he doesn't then grow up into the R. Kelly that abuses people. And they had a psychologist on the show who spoke about, a child psychologist, who said that people who experience abuse and violence as children are much more likely to replicate that abuse and violence when they're adults. So if we want to stop child molesters, we have to deal with that rather than just, relying on prisons and policing to do the work that actual healing, actual counseling, and actual care is supposed to do.
Let me just say this. I agree 110% with what you've said. Let me say two things. One, I never referred to...
I'm at 70%.
What'd you say, Charles?
I say I'm at 70%.
Oh, okay.
I have a little more work to do with both of you.
No, so one, I just want to be clear that I never referred to anyone as a monster. I was a public defender because
That's my word. Sorry.
I just want to be clear. I actually care for the people whom I've represented over the years and consider it an honor to do so. And I do believe, to borrow my fellow alumnus's phrase, that nobody is as bad as their worst act, that every child of God has a redeeming quality within him and her, and so forth. So I would push back on that word a bit. And second, here's what I'm 100% of. If we can create the social conditions that make prison unnecessary, you got me. And we certainly have alternatives for very, very, very many people. But if we can create the social conditions to make prison unnecessary for everybody, then then obviously. But I think the sort of hard policy question is, what do you do until then? So the problem is that investments go into prison and not into changing the social conditions that conspire to produce the criminal. And I think that we have to think about how we better allocate the resources. But in the meantime, what does one do with the most violent person among us? So for whatever reason, the fixing of the social conditions haven't worked, and you still have this person who represents a danger to the society or to himself. Well, what do we do? Very serious, very grave danger. What do we do? This may be a whole panel in and of itself, but I think it's an important question to flag. And I do 100% agree that we do have to allocate many more resources to the sorts of things that help reduce crime, reduce recidivism. I mean, people for years sort of poo-pooed ideas like midnight basketball and these sorts of things that had proven demonstrable impact on criminality, and criminologists, sociologists have done all sorts of studies. I mean, we can make decisions as a society that can help us reduce crime. The correlation between education level and criminality is mind-blowing. I mean, absolutely mind-blowing, right? Is it a wonder that most juvenile crime happens between juvenile robberies, huge number, I forget, between 4 and 7? You've got two things in action: unsupervised young people, right, and adults at work. Perfect for robberies. I mean, there are things we can do, right, if we want to reduce crime. So I'm not suggesting we don't do those things also. Those are very, very important as well. I talked too much. I'm sorry. That was too long.
No. It's okay. We have a couple minutes left. You know, I think where the rubber meets the road here, though, is that the people invest in the idea that policing, that prisons are solutions to social problems. And the more we invest in that idea, the more we invest in that with our dollars. And so that's what people in the streets are saying. Defund the police is saying, we don't want police responding to issues. We actually want to respond to the root cause of issues with housing, with education, with food security, with clean water, and everything else. And I think that same conversation is happening now as people are reevaluating relationships to prison. You know, it is to say, we don't want to just throw humans in cages. If somebody has a drug issue, we want to get them counseling and treatment and care. We don't want to throw them in a cage. And the only other thing I'll say, again, just taking moderator's license, is the whole idea of crime is something that is defined by people in power. So we can talk about harm and we can talk about violence, but crime is something that has all of the bias that politicians have. So I think robbery is a really good example, because wage theft is to the tune of $20 billion per year, but that's not considered a crime. It's something that's generally dealt with in civil court. You know, I can steal $20 from you and I can end up in prison, but if my employer siphons off a big chunk of my paycheck every single week and does that to millions of other people, they get a slap on the wrist or a fine or something like that. So just interrogating the idea of crime as well, I think, is important here.
Right. I mean, all true, but we do have the notion of malum in se versus malum prohibitum in our law, and you know, those examples are malum prohibitum, things that we can define as law or not. But there are some things, received wisdom, you might call it, tradition even, but that we consider bad in and of itself. And those are the things I'm just pushing to for us to think about as well. Wholly agree with other things, and we can figure, and you can define those in or out. You know, is there some magic about a light being red that makes it criminal not to stop? No. But you know, slaughtering a 2-year-old, our collective human wisdom tells us that thing is bad. And what do you do with the person that commits that? And Amber, you're the only one who's somehow turned me into a prosecutor all of a sudden. I don't know how in the heck you've got me arguing this side of this old criminal defense lawyer.
I'm trying to turn you into an abolitionist, not a prosecutor.
But that's my admonition.
Ron, think Bernie, Amber, think Bernie Madoff.
Terrible, absolutely terrible. And there were a lot of interventions that should have taken place before he stole people's pensions and Social Security money in retirement. I'm from South Florida, actually, and that hit home really, really hard for me. Absolutely terrible. And there should be something done about that. For the vast majority of people don't fall into Bernie Madoff's case, because most people who do the types of things he does don't end up in prison. Okay, we're at 7:01. I'm the moderator. I have to be responsible. I'd like to give each of you a few seconds, closing thoughts on this idea, and then we'll cut it off. Sorry for going over, but what a rich conversation.
Amber, can you hear me?
Yes.
Before we have closing thoughts, I just wanted to throw out something that I got in the chat in case that can be addressed in your closing thoughts, Professor Sullivan and Freed. Someone asked if you could speak to the intersection of juvenile justice and the private prison system. I know you did that a little bit, Professor Sullivan, but in your closing remarks, if you have any thoughts on that, that would be awesome. And then my question was about, if Harvard is invested in this system, then how do we then trust the professors who are teaching us in the classroom to give us tools to dismantle these systems? How do we balance that out? When you say we have mala prohibitum, mala in se, like they're teaching us these things, but can we trust that it's not incentivized by continuing to fuel our institution? So if you can address either of those in your closing remarks, that'd be awesome.
Charles, why don't you go first? I've been yapping.
Well, I'm not aware of the fact that any part of my salary goes to being quiet on something like this. I think my salary goes to my being able to think about what's right and wrong and following those arguments where they take me. That's why I gave you the little history of how I came to this. I think that's true of an awful lot of us. We wouldn't be here if we couldn't follow our noses in that way. And I think whatever you may think about Harvard, it is not corrupt in that way, no.
So on my close and to try to get those couple questions on the intersection of juvenile crime and the prison industrial complex. So, and this may be the subject for yet another, the Harvard Law Forum may have 100 topics here on criminal law, but our juvenile justice system is completely in disarray right now. There needs to be a number of wraparound considerations when dealing with juveniles. They need educational advocates. They need civil legal service lawyers. They need persons to social workers, persons to help fix the things that are going awry in their lives that give rise to what is referred to as delinquent behavior, and that goes into part of what Amber was saying. But the central question here, to my thinking, is an easy one. An institution like Harvard should by no means be investing in private prisons, right, or the companies that own private prisons. That's an easy one. With respect to the potential conflict of interest, I agree with Charles on that. Until I think Amanda reached out to me, I didn't even know Harvard was invested in private prisons. And now that I know it, I mean, you can tell by this forum, I'm saying, get out. I've never felt compelled to toe a party line on anything like that. And that's a benefit of being at a place like Harvard that for the most part, with some very well-known exceptions, actually embraces a notion of or the value of freedom of expression and intellectual independence. So I'm not aware of any faculty member who would feel constrained in that way, or frankly, you know, I mean, I should go figure out what Harvard invests in, because I've frankly had no earthly clue what is going on at that level of the institution. But it's important, as evidenced by this, and you know, we might find other things that are problematic. And I'll just end by saying it applies both to the conversation about private prisons and about Harvard itself. Just because something is more efficient does not mean that it is better. We could provide a more efficient, a more economical education to our students, fewer professors, fewer offerings, and we could provide students with a minimum level of exposure, and they can leave with the sufficient levels of aptitude to pass a bar exam. But you know, that's not our aim. We aspire to something better, and the same holds for prisons. Yes, you can produce this product more efficiently by going to the private market, but it suffers in quality, and America aspires to be something different. People don't lose their humanity because they've been convicted. Their liberty interests are abridged, but not eradicated altogether. Thanks for the time, folks.
Thank you both so much for coming. Thank you again to the Harvard Law Forum and ACS for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you, Professors Freed and Professor Sullivan, for your time. And I will just say, for people who are curious to learn more, the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign has released reports on digging into what Harvard's endowment is invested in. Again, it's only 1% of the endowment because the other 99% of that black box is undisclosed, but we're working on getting more transparency and accountability. Thank you all so much again, and we hope to have another amazing, interesting, engaging conversation on these and other issues soon. Everyone be safe.
Thank you.